black car in London. This happened years ago when I was barely 14. My middle school, and middle school of my best friend at the time, organized a trip abroad to Great Britain. London, to be exact. It's supposed to be a few days looking at London attractions, museums, and shops. It was fun. Until it wasn't. For the day before we were supposed to leave and go home, we were brought to the streets with some interesting shops, and we received free time for shopping. And then, our teachers and guide had a brilliant idea. They told us after the time for shopping ends, we have to meet at different streets than this. In retrospect, it was like 100 meters away, but they still shouldn't do that. Most of us have never been in London. We barely speak English. We don't have a map of the city, and roaming services don't work correctly. 90% of the students got lost. I got lost with my best friend because we went in the complete opposite direction. We were both confused about the directions we were given. We were walking along the pavement. My friend was running ahead or staying behind to nervously look around. We didn't look like we were together because we were not interacting with each other. I guess that's why this happened. My friend ran ahead and stopped to look around when I saw a black car approach me and match my speed. I started to feel like this was a scene from a movie. It was broad daylight, there were a lot of people around, and no one reacted. I was confused and I didn't know what was happening. Then from the car stepped out a man and said, "You are nice, come with me," and then tried to grab me. The car was still running, so I suppose someone was still in it. I was stunned. I didn't believe this was real. At that moment, my friend ran from behind me, grabbed me and dragged me away. We ran and tried to lose tail if the man or the car followed us. After some time we stopped and my friend nervously cried, shaking me and screaming why I didn't move when the man tried to catch me. I explained my deer in headlights moment. We cooled down and managed to ask some people for help, and we were found by our teachers. We didn't tell anyone about what happened. We were sure no one would believe us. After that, when we got back, I told my parents and I never went on a trip organized by my school again. My mom considered all of that really unprofessional and irresponsible. This creepy night guard tried to kidnap me. This happened about 20 years ago. I was 9 years old at the time, but my parents have also told me their side of the story on a bunch of different occasions, so that should help. My parents are both biologists. They met at work, and from there it's history. The place where they worked at the time was a government building dedicated to biology research, used in government projects turned towards the public, meaning they were the ones studying the environment and making environmental protection laws around their studies. This being a massive old government building, it always had a security guard present, day and night. During the day, these security guards would mostly just stay at the reception and greet people. But at night, they would go through their rounds and make sure that there were no intruders because of all the science equipment and computers kept in the building. One of these guards is the Let'sNotMeet guy. Initially, he seemed like the nicest person. He was really nice to me, and frankly, all of the memories I have of him before this were really nice. He would greet me and talk to me in the nicest way every time my parents brought me to work. He would make me paper planes, which he was surprisingly good at, and throw them around me. And he would stay with me at the reception in the days my parents had to work into the night. Obviously for me, that would get really boring, really fast. So he'd keep me company and entertain me. Mostly we would talk, play with the paper planes, and watch TV. It all seemed nice enough. Nice enough for my parents to trust him with me, which was probably their biggest mistake. One night, my parents had to go to work even later than usual. I think it was around 10 p.m., and they were still at it. So this guy who was on the night shift decided to take me around the building with him to do his rounds. We started on the top floor, checking all the rooms in the exterior part of the roof. Every room was so dark I'd only stay a little behind and wait for him to turn on the lights. Then we stepped down on the second floor, where my parents' office and labs were. We checked the opposite side of the building, going into labs with massive extractors and every kind of science equipment you might think of. We walked down the stairs to the first floor, where most of the administrative rooms were. I still remember seeing those maps on the walls and the embalmed fish everywhere serving as decorations. First floor was all clear, so it was time to check the 2 basement levels. I thought it would have made sense to check the labs on the right side first, as the left side had a flight of stairs at the end loading up to where my parents were, but for some reason, he decided we'd check that side first. We checked all the labs, but I noticed his pace was accelerating, and he was starting to look around and sound happier, excited even. Once again, we checked all the labs, all the corners from one end to another, turning the lights on ahead of us and turning them off behind us when we left. When we got to the last area, he turned all the lights on and we went inside. There were 3 separate offices on each side of the lab, and on the first one, he hurried towards the printer, opened it up, and took out 2 pieces of paper and made 2 quick paper planes. That's when everything changed. He picked up one of the planes, went outside of the office, and threw it towards the end of the room. He then told me the one he just threw was mine, and that we could throw them around in there. I ran to the other side of the room to pick my plane up, excited to play with it, and suddenly, the lights went off. When I turned around to check what was happening, I saw him getting out of the lab, turning the lights off and locking the door. I ran to the door, punched it, and kicked it while screaming for him to open, panic taking over me because of how scared I was from being in the dark at that time. Through the glass door, I could see him scurrying away in the corridors, turning off the lights as he went and disappearing after turning a corner. I'm pretty sure that everything I felt and every shadow and creepy monster I saw in there while waiting was part of my imagination because of how scared I was. I balled up against the corner and could see shadows moving around me in the dark. I could almost cry, lost, not knowing what was happening and why he was doing that. My parents finished the work eventually, and when they did, they packed up their things and made their way to the lobby to pick me up and go home. When they got there, the security guard was at the reception, but I was nowhere to be found. They panicked, of course. Must have shouted 100 different cuss words at the guy, and I'm not sure how my dad didn't murder him right then and there. But when they first asked the guy where the hell I was and what he had done with me, he simply said that he had gone to do his rounds with me, and I must have gotten lost somewhere. This is the building that would take you about an hour and a half to check from top to bottom, even if you're rushing. So must have gotten lost somewhere is not exactly helpful. They must have looked for hours without finding me. It was only when I saw a light far at the end of the corridors leading to the lab I was in that I got the courage to stand up, rush towards the door, and start punching it as hard as I could. They finally found me there and made the guard unlock the door to get me out. I don't really remember sleeping that night, and if I did, it must have been out of exhaustion. But I know I made my mom stay in the bedroom with me the entire night. Of course, my parents made a complaint against the guard, and when they did, the guy started being investigated. He was fired and arrested, not because of locking me away where he probably hoped no one would find me, but because he had been partnering up with other criminals to steal computers and equipment from the building to sell in some shady market, along with the information in the hard drives and make money off it. By then, he had stolen a lot of old computers without anyone realizing, and who knows what his plans were for me that night. I'm not convinced that locking a crying kid in the middle of the darkness, hidden away in some room, is exactly the most normal behavior, if you're not trying to hide them and come get them later when everyone is left and sell them as part of your product. Luckily, he never had the chance to do that, and I really hope he never got to do it to any other kid. The Uber driver who just wouldn't leave. I was chatting to a friend and remembered this creepy story from the pandemic. I, a 30-year-old woman, lived alone. I had no car, no shops nearby. It was 9 p.m. and I had got back from work and realized that there was no food in the house. So I ordered a grocery delivery on Uber Eats. I asked them to leave it at the door due to the COVID rules. There was a knock at the door, and I saw a tall, skinny guy standing right by it. I shouted through the letterbox to leave it at the front door and back up. He said no, and that he had to hand it to me as it had alcohol in it. I hadn't ordered any alcohol, so I told him that he had the wrong order. He claimed it was correct. I told him sternly to put it on the floor and back up, and again he refused. Stupidly, I opened the door a crack to tell him to do it due to COVID rules, and he stepped towards the door and put his hand on the handle. I pulled it shut and shouted to leave, or I was reporting him. He put it down and stepped back. I asked him through the letterbox to back up further. He did, but again when I opened the door he stepped forward. I always remember the chill down my spine when he said, "Pretty, very pretty," in a low monotone. I noticed he had his phone out and pointed at me, and asked what he was doing. He said he had to take a picture, but it was pointed at my face and not the bag on the floor. I grabbed it and slammed the door shut and locked it. I watched through the crack in the curtains as he stood by the door, pacing back and forth as if he couldn't make up his mind. He knocked, but I ignored it. I was getting seriously creepy vibes and called my best mate for advice. She told me to report him and not open the door. I shouted out the letterbox for him to leave, but he still stood there. My dog had picked up on my anxiety and started barking at the door. He turned and got in his car that was parked across the street from my house. I kept watching for the next 10 minutes or so through my window, but he wouldn't leave. He just sat there, but I figured maybe he was picking up another order to take. Suddenly, a message popped up on Uber. He told me he'd forgotten a bag in the car and asked me to come get it. I checked my order and it was all there, so I messaged saying it wasn't mine. He got insistent, saying he couldn't leave until I picked it up. He was practically begging me to come to the car, saying it wouldn't take a minute and I could grab it from the passenger side. I lost my shit. I told him I heard what he said, that I knew he was taking a picture of me and not the order, and that I was calling the police. He still said I had to come get it. The entire time I was on the phone with the police, he was still messaging me, even saying, "The police not come. Pick up order and I leave. Why are you making it hard? The police told me someone would be there within 20 minutes and to stay inside with the doors locked. My dog was going nuts. Hawk was up barking. My neighbor's husband texted me saying he heard a commotion and asked if I was okay. I told him what was going on and he immediately ran out, shouting at the guy and to fuck off before he got fucked up. The delivery guy peeled out of there, and my neighbors came over to make me a brew and wait for the police. I made a report to both them and Uber, but all I got was an apology from Uber. I got a car shortly after, and didn't use Uber again until my boyfriend moved in. So to the creepy Uber driver, let's not meet again. I think I was almost human trafficked. About 3 years ago, I was a waitress during the height of COVID. It was my first ever job and I remember being so excited to start as soon as possible. After all my training was finished and I got my certifications, I was put on the closing shift. We closed at 10 p.m. every night at the time, and typically it was just my cook and I. Rarely would there be another waitress with me, and I liked it that way. I always worked better alone, and I didn't really get along with most of the other waitresses anyway, so it was nice. I can remember it was near the end of my time that this experience happened, and I'm really happy I had the circumstance I did at the time. I never really could trust my gut very much because I had mild anxiety, and couldn't tell if what I felt at the time was valid or not. I mentioned this because when it all went down, it felt real, and I had an absolute feeling. I started my shift at around 3 p.m. I said goodbye to the last waitress and I was on my own with my cook. Everything was pretty slow and normal, until I got a call about one of the specialty items on the limited time menu we had. The food couldn't be ordered as takeout, and the lady over the phone really didn't take it well. After a little debating, she finally decided to sit in and eat instead. I'd say around 10 to 20 minutes later is when I spotted an older looking car pull up, and these 3 people came out. 2 men and a woman who looked to be in their 30s to 40s. I could tell it was the same lady I spoke to over the phone, judging by her attitude coming in. I further confirmed it by asking since I already had a pretty good idea of what she wanted to eat. What I thought was an act of mild embarrassment and pettiness was actually something much more sinister later on. Her attitude towards me changed when she saw me. She was much nicer and more cooperative. This didn't ring any bells at first, because it was something that most people who wanted to look good in front of others would do. I sat them at a booth and took their orders. I noticed they had a red binder and a black pen. Remember this. I then went to tend to my other customers as there were a couple of tables I was waiting on. Once I brought their food out to them, they asked me if I knew any realtors. I found this to be normal, as this being the tourist vacation state it is, it wasn't uncommon for outsiders to be looking for getaway homes. I would say this was very reasonable for me to assume it was nothing, if they didn't already look like the unsavory type of people, if you get what I mean. Nonetheless, I gave them the phone number of a realtor I knew closely and well, since I often went to church with her. There wasn't any notable interactions I really had aside from the occasional small talk, if I wasn't doing anything or refilling their drinks. It was around 4:30 p.m. now, and they were the last on my tables to leave the restaurant. If any of you were in the food industry, you know that as a server, you don't really get breaks, just a lunch most of the time, and sometimes not even that if it's a super busy day. So my cook and I took this as an opportunity to take a well-deserved break. We walked out behind them and had a small chat with them. I should mention by now that the front of the restaurant had a disabled ramp coming up to the doors. It was long because the building was on a raised foundation. This is important. Now, I didn't really notice at the time, but one of the men took my cook to the other side of the ramp, down near the end, and was chatting with him over a cigarette. I was behind the railing at the top of the platform where the ramp plateaued. Luckily, the other man and the woman were on the other side of the railing, about 5 feet below me but in front of me. We were having some small talk, and they started to ask some personal questions, such as if I lived in this area, if I smoked weed, how old I was, etc. I hadn't quite learned yet that telling strangers such personal things wasn't a good idea. However, this for some reason was starting to raise some red flags. I gave very vague answers to all her questions as best I could. Unfortunately, they still persisted in trying to have some sort of communication with me outside of my work, whether or not I said no. I suppose when they finally realized that I wasn't going to give that information up, the woman finally got to her point. She told me that she had a business offer for me. It was for a cleaning service. I don't like cleaning anyways, so regardless I would have said no. However, what she said next solidified the answer. She proceeded to tell me that she owned a maid service called the Pretty Kitties Maid Service. She said that they need pretty young girls like me, that she had 10 girls now as it was, and she wanted to expand. She mentioned how they all got paid $30K, she didn't specify the time length, and how it would be a great opportunity for me to help her with her business. I instantly knew at that point that it certainly wasn't a maid service business, and I was in danger. However, I didn't understand just how much danger I was in. I politely declined her offer and told her I liked my job as it was. that I was satisfied working for my boss. She tried to further convince me by telling me how easy it was and reiterating how much I'd make under her supervision. She mentioned how she had a van for her business and described it to me. I can't exactly remember what she told me, but I do remember how she told me to follow her to her car. She said she showed me a picture of her van in her car, but her phone was in her hands. I knew for certain I wasn't going anywhere with her, or near that car. I declined yet again, and said that I was fine right where I was. I said she could show me her phone instead, but she was hesitant. After which she proceeded to end the conversation and left with the two men. A little shaken, I walked back into the restaurant with my cook and told him what I had just experienced. He joked about how I'd have good money if I went with them. Because I didn't take the situation as seriously as I should have, I laughed with him. At the end of that night, the cook's grandmother came to pick us up. I mentioned the weird interaction. A panicked look came over her and she sat silent, staring at me. I got confused and asked her if everything was okay. That's when I learned the signs of human trafficking. She broke it to me that I was almost trafficked, and that I was incredibly lucky I didn't get kidnapped. My stomach dropped and I started to panic at the realization of just how much danger I was in. Nothing really happened after that, except for that red binder and black pen I told you to remember. I went to work the next day and a customer walked in. Now, normally in my part of town, not many people like to sit and relax for a while. They're mostly just there to eat and leave, as it wasn't exactly a cafe. When I get into my apron, I sit this gentleman. He was well dressed, not in a suit and tie, but just nicely dressed. He was alone. I sat him at a booth and took his order of one single coffee, and he had a red binder and black pen with him. I didn't even notice until my cook from the night before reminded me of it. I was so shocked at the fact, and it unsettled me even more that he proceeded to sit there for 3 hours, watching me as I tended to my tables. I kept asking if he needed anything else, and he asked me if people never just sat and relaxed with coffee. I sort of shrugged and said no, not here. Now, this might come as a surprise to some of you, but servers, believe it or not, do listen in on some of your conversations. I'm lucky I did with this one. I specifically remember him speaking over the phone about finances and how he needed to find another house. He spoke about moving money and how he was going to pay his girls that night. I ran to the back of the kitchen and told the cook. Thankfully, he came out to help deliver some plates in order to throw the guy off. It worked, I think. He ended up leaving not long after that, and I haven't seen or heard anything since. I'll tell you though, I've been much more on guard since then. TLDR, I was almost human trafficked and didn't know. Thanks to some gut feelings, I wound up as one of the lucky ones. No, I wasn't able to report them because their car was facing forward towards the building cameras, and we couldn't see the license plate. Yes, I told my manager, and he never allowed any of the servers to leave the building without someone else walking them out. I made it known throughout the whole staff about what happened since I didn't want any of them to get hurt. I used this story as a way to tell others to please be safe and be aware of your surroundings. I didn't think this could happen to me. It could happen to anyone. Be safe and be observant. The old man in the apron up the road wouldn't leave me or my family alone. So, for context, I grew up in the suburbs, and outside of the occasional play park or sports field, there was nothing to do. Me and my neighbors used to play knock and run, or its other name, ding dong ditch. For context, I have a sister who is a year younger than me, and my neighbor James is the same age as me. His older sister was 14 at the time, and she also played with us from time to time. Also, I think she just wanted to hang out with my sister, whom she thought was cute. I was admittedly the biggest coward in the group, and to this day, my flight instinct is significantly stronger than my fight instinct. I would also never ring the doorbell, as I would always find a way to wiggle out of it. I always found watching it more entertaining than doing it. On this particular afternoon, my cousins came over. One of my cousins was my age, the other was a few years younger than me and couldn't play with us, and the other was a year older than me. But everyone treated him like he was an adult, even though he was only 11, or at least that's how I perceived it. Let's call this cousin Daniel, as he is somewhat important to the story. I'm not a reliable narrator, as it's been almost 10 years since these events, but I would try my hardest to remember them. Anyway, I'm getting off topic. My cousins came over and we were banished outside to play, and we all decided that knock and run was a good idea. We usually just played around our immediate street, never venturing further than the next street over, out of fear of getting lost in the copied and pasted suburban streets. We made our way up the street to the play park at the top of the hill. It sat where a house could have been, and someone could cut across it onto the next road. As we sat on the play equipment, we decided that a vote should decide who knocked first, and of course, I was picked. I remember getting myself out of it, and getting my older cousin to take my place. I am thankful that he was, and is as proud as he is. It helped me get out of a lot of situations. We decided that our first target would be the fanciest looking house in the area, a white marble house with a fountain in the front yard and a curved driveway. I remember sitting next to a car, as I was small enough to look under it from the curb, and I had a clear view of my cousin sneaking up to the door and ringing the doorbell 3 times in order to get the attention of whoever was inside. Then he bolted down the pathway towards the street to hide behind the cars. But before he got to the fence, an older man in a black leather apron with what I assumed was paint came sprinting after him. I immediately knew something was wrong. This wasn't the usual response to a knock and run. Sure, we had encountered some angry people before, but this was something very different. He practically flew down the walkway towards Daniel and threw his hands out to grab him. This didn't feel like anything someone his age could do, and it scared the shit out of me. I think I might have been the only one with a clear view of what was going on, which meant that I was the only one to see what was happening. It wasn't until the man was practically on top of Daniel that he noticed he was being chased, and the scream that he made when he realized this will always stick with me. As I said at the start of this, Daniel was and still is a very proud person who will always try to prove himself. So hearing this scream of pure terror struck at my core. Everyone was clued in at this point as to what was happening. Daniel didn't open the waist-high gate at the end of the path, he just jumped it, which I think ultimately saved them from getting hurt as the old man had to take a second to open it. Daniel was sprinting down the street as fast as I had ever seen him. "Stop, you little shit," the man shouted with a deep, angry voice, which did actually stop Daniel in his tracks. They were both standing in the middle of the road at this point, reminding me of an old western movie when 2 cowboys would be standing at either end of the main road. The man marched straight up into Daniel's face, and I could finally get a good look at him. His skin resembled rough leather, and a few strands of hair on his head had long since grayed. He was clean shaven, and he was wearing simple white pants, a white button-up, and a black leather apron that had what I had rationalized as red paint on it. After he was maybe half a foot from Daniel, he started to berate him, and I could only make out the words, "Sick people in there." Everything about this man threw me off, and I could see my neighbor and my other cousin, who was hiding in the bushes, felt the same. My neighbor's older sister, who I'll call Tay, screamed out at him from the other side of the road, which gave Daniel the opportunity to run as fast as he could away from the man. We all ran at that point. I don't think I or anyone else knew where we were running off to, but I found myself in the car park of the shopping center across the road from me. I waited there for maybe 30 minutes, just watching cars come in and out, feeling safer with the large group of people. I had no idea at the time if he chased one of us, but I knew that I was safe. I made my way back to my house and found that I was the last one to return. My cousin Daniel ran straight home, and Tay followed him. My other cousin and neighbor ran around the suburbs for a bit before deciding to go home. My mom was missing when I got home, and I realized that she had been told what happened. My mother is someone who isn't afraid of protecting her own, and she is one of the strongest people I know, so I felt pretty safe that she was aware and was off telling him to fuck off. But when she got back, she seemed off. She didn't want to talk about it or anything, and any color from her face had completely drained. We slept at my neighbor's house that night because my mom wanted to talk to my dad about something serious. I think we all knew what it was about. Nothing happened for a while after that. Not for a while. But my mom was a lot more protective of what we did outside. We were no longer allowed to play knock and run, or go up the road without a parent. It really bugged my sister, who loved to play outside, but I don't think she fully understood what happened. I have a lot more stories about this guy, and I probably will write more, because this has helped me get a better grip on everything that happened throughout that year. But I hope you enjoy the very first event of one of the worst periods of my life. Okay, so before I get into the next few events, I think that it is more important to address some things that I've read in the last post. I know that we were the ones who originally disturbed them, but I thought that it was important to dedicate a post to that event, as it kind of kicked off a lot of stuff. I will probably update this post with a few more stories just to get it all out there, but I just wanted to say that I fully understand my and everyone else's part to play in part 1, but I believe that the issue really began after that, which is what I'll show you today. I'm sorry if I upset anyone. Thank you all for the positive reception to part 1. It means a lot to me that people are interested in what I've got to say, which makes me feel better about writing about the other events. First things first, I promised a few of you that I would ask my mom what the old man had told her last night at dinner, and I did manage to do so. She was surprised that I remember what happened and tried to sweep it under the rug, but I kept pressing her for answers. I'm not proud of pressuring my mother into talking to me about something like this, but curiosity got the better of me. I know that that isn't an excuse, but I feel it somewhat justifies my actions, as a lot of you wanted to know as well. After I pressed her for more answers, she grabbed my arm and led me to my room before placing me on my bed. She sat next to me and told me not to repeat anything of what I said to my sister, my cousins, or anyone else who was involved with that man throughout the year. She finally opened up about how she was sitting at home watching TV when she heard a loud knock at the front door. It was my cousin Daniel and my neighbor Tay, who looked terrified and exhausted. After letting them in and grilling them for answers, my mom was rightfully pissed that someone had spoken to them in such a way, and so she got up to go and confront the man. And on her way out, my other cousin and neighbor arrived, who she also sent inside. She was concerned about where I was, but Daniel made it clear that I had ran in the opposite direction of the man and that he would go out looking for me. My mom made her way to the play park and saw the man pacing back and forth up and down his driveway. He didn't seem angry or upset. He apparently didn't seem like anything besides someone marching back and forth, which took my mother's mood from enraged to confused. She walked up to the front gate and let herself in, which made the man stop almost immediately and stare at her. I'm surprised she didn't turn back and go home at that point, because that's what I imagine anyone would have done. But as I said in part 1, I am a coward. The man marched up to my mom and started to berate her about trespassing on his property, which she met by berating him about terrifying some kids. This apparently went on for a couple minutes before he said something that terrified her. My mom didn't exactly say what this was, because she said that she was trying to forget it, but he said something along the lines of, "I'll show you both what it feels like to have somebody on your property when you don't want them there, and then I'll shut those fucking kids up forever." He tried to grab her at that point, but she quickly moved away and left his yard, swiftly walking back home. This really affected my mom, but that was the answer I got from her. I gave her a hug and apologized for pressing her to tell me, and we got back to dinner shortly after. I don't regret her telling me, but it just feels like knowing the end of a movie and seeing all of the hints leading up to it, recontextualizing a lot of stuff. It had been about a month, maybe a month and a half since the first initial incident with the man. We hadn't seen him since, and I was forgetting about it until I went to the shops one day. For context, my parents had started to let me go to the shops by myself to grab little things for them. I was young at the time, and the shops were across the road from me, so getting there wasn't an issue. One day, my dad asked me to go and grab a loaf of bread for him. He gave me $2 coins and sent me on my way to the shops. I was getting used to doing this on my own and enjoying my independence. I grabbed the bread, which was on the far side of the large supermarket, and made my way towards the registers. I stopped by the toy aisle and took a look at all the low-quality mass-produced action figures that I desperately wanted. This was part of my routine. Even now, if I wanted something but didn't have the money to get it, I would just go look at it. But on this occasion, I wish I had just continued to the registers. I felt 2 hands push me on the ground from my left. I was shocked for a moment, as I didn't fully know what had just happened. The sticky and dusty floor beneath me hurt. It took me a second to look at my attacker, and when I did, I immediately knew this was very wrong. It was the old man from up the road. He had found me in the place that I had hid from him just a month prior. He started to shout at me, but I couldn't understand what he was saying. I don't know if it was just the adrenaline ringing in my ears, or his rage just taking over, but the tone in which he was shouting shook me. I tried to get up and run, and when I planted my foot on the ground to get up, he kicked it out from below me, which made me fall back on the ground. Thank God a staff member arrived at this point. They must have heard me shouting from across the store and came to check on what was happening. I didn't get a good look at the staff member, but I am thankful for them. As I got up to run with the loaf of bread in my hand, I could hear the man reacting to me getting away, and it took everything in me to not look behind me to look at him, but I knew he was furious. I ran straight out of the store with the bread without realizing it, and almost threw up from all of the emotions. I told my parents when I got home, and they both made it clear that I wouldn't be going on any shopping trips by myself from here on out. They didn't think about how me and my sister walked together to school, which in hindsight should have been something that they thought of. The trip to my school wasn't a long one. It was just over a kilometer long, or just over half a mile, but the trip was still tough on small legs. There were quite a few hills, which added time to our trip there, and the path went along a creek with nothing around it. It was nice and isolated, which helped me relax my mind after school. Not long after the supermarket incident, me and my sister were walking home from school and just made our way to the beginning of the path along the creek when we saw an SUV that had been parked there for what I had assumed had been a while. I thought it was empty, but as you could probably guess, it wasn't. We turned to enter the creek when the SUV car door opened, and we heard someone shouting out to us, "Hey, do you guys want to drive home?" It was the man. My sister, who was always trusting of others, started to walk towards the truck, but I quickly held her back. "What's wrong?" said the man in a cheerful tone. This was very different from the unintelligible screaming from just the week before, and I obviously wanted nothing to do with this man. I quickly started to lead my sister towards the creek, and the man quickly scooted over towards the door. "Wait up, I'll walk you home." I should have just run up the hill towards the school, but instead I started to sprint down the creek. Looking back at this, I feel stupid. Daniel was faster than me, and the man had been able to catch up to him in seconds, but for some reason he didn't leave his truck. All I heard was another unintelligible scream and his truck driving away. My sister was beyond pissed that we didn't get a ride home, and that we had to walk, but I didn't care. She and I were safe, and so we continued walking along the path. Thinking back to it, the path was beautiful and connected on either side to small, quiet streets, the perfect in-between of isolation. Sadly, my young mind didn't realize that the creek opened up to two quiet streets, and so when I saw the same silver SUV on the street at the end of the path, I froze. What could I have done? I felt powerless and had to take care of my sister, who was only now figuring out that this man may not have good intentions. I decided that the best course of action was to cross the creek and walk through the bushes to the other side. This was beyond a dangerous idea as there were slippery rocks, animals, and running water. This could very easily have injured or killed us, but somehow we managed. We climbed over logs of wood and under tree branches, through prickly bushes, and through large plants, but we managed to do it and crossed over to the other road that we followed towards the main road which took us home. Obviously, those two SUVs could have been different, but at the time, I was certain that they were the same, and even now I'm not 100% sure if they were different. I only found out about this later, but my parents got the police involved at this point. But based on the fact that much more stuff happened, I'm going to say that they probably didn't do much. There were a few other things that happened throughout this time, like mail being stolen, our bins being pushed over, and the front door knocking at early hours of the morning that we knew were him, although we had no real proof. The last thing I will bring up before I end this post is something that I'm not 100% sure was a dream or not. For context, my dad used to have campouts with me and my sister. We would sleep out on the couch, and my dad would sleep on a mattress on the floor. The couches we would sleep on were right next to the front door in the living room, and we would watch movies with pizza or some other type of takeaway. It was really fun, and I remember those nights. But one particular night will stick with me. Everyone else went to sleep, and Naruto was on. I hadn't watched or read Naruto at that point, but I recognized the characters. I was sitting directly next to the large window that looked out onto the driveway. I was just enjoying doing nothing when I saw some movement out on the driveway, and so I looked out, and there he was, walking up to our front door, wearing his white pants and white button-up t-shirt. He was staring directly at our front door with such focus that it felt like nothing would break it, but something did. It was me. He looked at me, and I could see in his eyes that it was funny to him. He simply held his hand up, waved at me, and then placed one finger on his mouth as if he were telling me to shush. Then he jogged away. I surprisingly fell asleep not long after, and for the longest time I thought it was a dream, until I read all of Naruto and recognized the scene. It was then that I realized that it might not have actually been a dream, and that he might have been attempting something, and after what my mom had told me, I think I know what he was trying to do. So it's been a while since I've given you guys an update. I've been busy with school, and digging up these memories is a little distracting for me. I would like to thank all of you for the incredibly positive responses to my post. It makes me feel better about all this. But without further ado, let's just start the story. It was summer, and the local council decided to have a fair. The local council hired a few clowns, some face painting stations, food trucks, and bouncy castles at the local football field. Of course, me and my sister were beyond excited to go. For a young child, this was the hottest ticket in town, and my parents were happy to take us, as it was just down the road and free. I remember the field being beyond busy. The crowd was difficult to walk in, and even harder to see through, but we managed to find ourselves right next to the giant blow-up bouncy slide. As it was summer, the actual balloon of the slide burned to the touch, and the sun made me feel like I was slowly melting. Regardless of this, I must have spent at least 40 minutes going up and down that slide. I was having too much fun and didn't notice both my parents and sister had gone missing in the giant crowd of people. I got down from the slide, put my shoes back on, and started to make my way through the crowd. I didn't actually know where I was going, and I remember feeling incredibly anxious as I waddled around the fair. It wasn't until I felt a hand on my shoulder and then my forearm that I felt a little safer. It was my dad. I thought he had found me. I couldn't actually tell whose arm it was, as the angle which it was holding my arm made it difficult to look at in the crowd. The whole day was overly stimulating, and I wasn't thinking clearly. I should have known from how hard the hand was gripping me, or the fact that it was leading me toward the parking lot, that something was wrong. I only really felt terror when I saw my parents running towards me, running faster than I had ever seen them run. Adrenaline immediately coursed through my veins. I pivoted my body around and immediately saw the leathery hand on my arms and white pants. The link was connected to my mind as to who it was. My mother's scream was the first thing I heard, and the angry or annoyed grunt of the old man followed it. He started to jog with me towards his truck, but I started to fight back against his grip. He may have been old, but he was stronger than any elderly person should be, and he was faster too. Everything about this man was wrong, and it may have been my very young mind making it all up, but I still believed that something was very weird about him. No elderly person should be like this. At this point, I was only a couple feet away from his car, and as he opened the door, I felt two hands on my right arm pull me hard against the man's grip. The man's grip held on before my dad came out from behind me and slammed the old man's head into his car, which loosened his grip on me. My mother grabbed me and ran, and we went straight home. Apparently, they didn't notice me slip away on the bouncy slide, and they ran into some family friends who offered to take care of my sister while they searched for me. I don't know what type of person it takes to do something like that in such a populated area, but this man was not normal. Not in the slightest. My dad returned later that night. He looked pretty roughed up and drained of all energy. From what I had gathered over the years, they got into a pretty brutal fight that ended with the police breaking it up. My dad didn't get into much trouble considering that he had called the police on the man before, but they still took him to the station to give a statement. When he sat down on the couch, he looked exhausted, bruises forming all over, and a cut on his lip and upper eyebrow still leaking blood. But he had a smile on his face, and I could hear him telling my mom that it was over. They were both hopeful, and so was I. A couple weeks later, my cousins came back over, and Daniel wanted to know everything. He felt like he was the main victim and deserved to know everything, because he was the one that the man shouted at, and the one that the man wanted to get the most. I don't disagree that the man would probably try to hurt him on sight, but it felt weird to me. Almost like he was trying to take credit for something that to him sounded like a creepy story, but to my family was real. Anyway, we decided to go out for a bit. My parents trusted us because we were with my older cousin. We went up to the usual play park, which was across the street from the man's currently vacant house. Daniel was telling us all about how he swore that he saw him near his house. Keep in mind that he lives almost 3 hours away. I'm not saying that he's a liar, but I am saying that he wanted to be part of this. Anyways, we were playing hide and seek. Tay, our neighbor, was seeking, and she had just only started to count down from 60. I always tagged along with Daniel because he always found the best spots. We ran across the road to the man's house, and Daniel jumped the fence, which I immediately stopped at. "Come on," he said from the other side of the waist-high fence. "No one will find us." The house felt like a void we would get sucked into, and I had up until this point refused to even be near it. But for some reason I agreed. I joined him in the man's yard, and to my shock, Daniel wanted to go deeper into his home, not just the yard. I made it clear that this was a very bad idea. Even if he was in custody, jail, or whatever, we would be breaking into someone's home. Daniel didn't seem scared by it though. I think the whole idea of being in the man's house seemed attractive to him. We went around the side of the fence to his backyard. It was overgrown, almost like no one had been living there for years. I made my way towards his back window and looked inside. From what I could make out, he was a hardcore minimalist, only having a TV, chair, fireplace, and a shelf that housed some photos of a much younger man with some medals. He was a veteran. It changes nothing to me, but it explains his above-average speed and strength, especially for his age. The sound of a door sliding open almost made me yell in fear. Daniel had found and unlocked the sliding door and wanted to venture inward. I ran around to find him, but he was already inside before I could stop him. At this point, I was also curious to find out more, but I understood the risk of this all. But it didn't matter if I understood it, because I went in with him. The rest of the house reflected the living room. The kitchen had a fridge and a stove, and the dining room only had a small table with one wooden chair. There was no decoration on the walls or sign of life besides the sad reminders of how lonely this man had been. As I said, this changes nothing for me. I hate this man more than anyone can know. We made our way upstairs and found 2 completely empty rooms and 1 bedroom. Just a single bed and a bedside table filled with different types of weapons. A hatchet, a knife, and a knuckle duster. I had never seen a knuckle duster before, and I successfully fought the urge to take it and put it on. This was something that Daniel failed to do, as he almost immediately grabbed it, which I almost hit him for. We continued to search the house, and Daniel had the idea that he must have something weird in his wardrobe, and when we opened it, he gave a disappointed sigh, as there was nothing inside, except a few white button-ups and white pants. This especially creeped me out as he never wore anything else. We made our way back downstairs and into the living room, and to our surprise, we missed the table that sat next to the couch. It was just out of view and only had 1 drawer. Daniel opened it and struggled to get it out fast, but when he did, we found something profoundly strange. It was a single photo. Neither of us could make out what it was, but we knew that it looked familiar. Daniel sat down in the chair bored, and it was only then that we heard Tay scream out that she had given up. Daniel shot up and sprinted back out to the backyard. We had both completely forgotten about her, but as I put the photo back in the drawer, something stood out to me about the photo. The fence was navy blue. This was something very unusual in my area, and I knew of only 1 navy blue fence in the suburb. Our side door entrance. This realization made the photo seem much more clearer. The white pebbles on the ground leading to the backyard, the cream color of the garage next to it, the green bush at the end of the path. This was my home. He had a photo of my home. I quickly met back up with Daniel and Tay, and we went back home. I should have told my parents, but I was scared that I would be in trouble if they found out that we were in his home. I understand why we would be, but I still didn't want to live up to it. About a month after that, we were having another camp out with me, my dad, and my sister. Both my sister and my dad had fallen asleep with the TV on still, illuminating the room. It was one of those weird situations where you were both really comfortable and really uncomfortable. This was my situation, and on most nights I loved this feeling. But that feeling will always be tied to this night. I was drifting off to sleep as well, but I heard the sliding back door open slowly. I peered up above the couch and saw the silhouette of a man standing in the doorway. I froze with fear and started to cry. My dad woke up at this point. I'm not entirely sure how. Maybe it was parental instinct, but he knew almost immediately that something was wrong. He got up off the bed and crouched towards the dining room, which is where the back door was. The other man had began to slowly walk through the house at this point. Murmuring to himself. To my horror, I recognized the pants. The bright white pants. So many questions went through my mind. The most prevalent one being, how? He was in custody. But none of that mattered because there he was, standing in my dining room, holding something. My dad charged him from around the corner and tackled him to the wall. The old man punched him in the arm, and my dad immediately dropped that arm. It was the knuckle duster that Daniel was wearing. It was at this point that the lights turned on. I don't know if it was my dad or the man, but they came on and my dad made a noise of pure horror. Both men were fully healed from their last fight, but my dad took a real beating. I had always expected that the old man had his ass kicked, but now I'm not so sure. My dad was standing in the doorway of the living room shielding us with his body. My sister was awake and crying at this time, as was I, and my mom also ran down the stairs and immediately saw everything that was going on. The man lunged at my dad with a thing in his hand that I could see was a hatchet. My dad threw himself to the side, and his other arm got grazed by the hatchet, drawing blood. My mom at this point leapt towards the old man and pushed him into the kitchen bench, which made him scream. But he was up almost as fast as he was down. He slashed at my mom and missed her, and my dad ran to the other room and started to call the police. My mom was dodging his slashes while also throwing things at him. Once she got to the knife block, she armed herself with 2 knives and threw one of them. The handle hit him in the face, knocking him back. My mom then took the opportunity and drove a knife into his shoulder, which made him scream again. He fell to the ground and didn't try to get up until the police arrived. After this happened, we moved. Not too far away, maybe just half an hour away. Even though we lived so close to that place, we have never returned. As much as I have been tempted to go back and relive some stuff, for the time being, I'm pretty comfortable staying here. Apparently he paid bail and was staying at the hospital for a while before staying at someone else's house. I know that he made his way back to his house before making it to my home. It creeps me out to think that I could have been in his home at the same time as him. Well, anyways, it's been 10 years, and it's been something that's been on my mind for a while. I want to thank you all for hearing my story, and I think it's tradition on this subreddit to say this. To the old fucking creep on the road who terrorized my family, let's not meet again. I want to give a special shout out to the Real Ghost Stories channel at Hell Street on YouTube, because their Let's Not Meet story was the one about the creepy night guard. If you like content like this, make sure to subscribe, and if you can, consider becoming a channel member. That's all for this video. I'm Cole Coffin, and as always, thanks for watching.